Hello everybody, you have tuned in to Eric Jose on Making a Murderer on YouTube. I cover virtually any aspect of making a murderer. I go over the evidence, the documents, the photos. So if you like, stay tuned, and in the future I'll have many more videos besides the one you're about to see. Hello folks, we're back today here talking one more time about the final segment of Nancy Grace's little podcast, where it mainly centered around, you know, obviously Brendan, his chances with the Supreme Court, his advocate that's there in studio, obviously, or that's part of the podcast, Vinu. There's all these things here, and they're talking about SCOTUS, and they're talking about what Brendan's chances really are and stuff. So we're here today to talk about a lot of things. Obviously, they're obviously got Tom Fassbender on here talking about, you know, why he thinks, you know, the evidence points the way it does, and you know, so we're gonna, and obviously I'm gonna be here to point out the things that aren't right, you know. But as you know, I mean, that's what I do here. So and just, I gotta say, check out and kind of pay attention to some of the misinformation that you get from this John Lee guy. This John Lee, he's like a reporter with the Post Crescent there in Wisconsin, who we all know John Farrak from the Post Crescent, right? Well, this guy, he's a different guy. He's a guy that buys everything the state says. If the state told him that you know, putting, you know, horse manure in his water would make it taste like, you know, sugar, he'd do it. Anyways, you just listen to some of the things he says. I mean, some of the things he says are just like so off the chart. It's like you can't help but wonder what world is he in, because the things that he is saying are just like, who said that? Whoever said that? What are you talking about, dude? And then there's the other guest she has on here, who is obviously clearly a clear agent for the state. Clearly buys everything the state says, hook, line, and sinker. So we're going to go ahead and move into this whole thing here, the final last segment about Nancy Grace's most recent podcast. So here we go.
But instead, his new defense lawyers put him on the stand with this unbelievable defense. What about the evidence, John Lee? And tell us everything makes you believe that Dassey and then Avery, in fact, raped and murdered her.
On Dassey, briefly, it's the forensic evidence. There's so much of it. On Dassey, people forget that Dassey had information that the investigators did not have at that time. They looked at the hood latch. They looked at the garage. They picked up his blue jeans after some of his statements.
Okay, so John Lee talks about a few things there. He talks about Brendan giving them information that they didn't previously have, or whatever, right? But we know that what Brendan gave them is almost all of it is uncorroborated, and most of it was fed to him. But we know that a lot of the things that they claim he suggested, pretty much all the things that they claim that he offered freely, were all things that couldn't be corroborated. The hair cutting, the blood, all of it. None of it can be corroborated by any kind of physical evidence. So he brings that up. And he brings up the garage, which is where the bullet was found, because they went into the garage after they coerced Brendan Dassey. They went back into the garage because they had repeatedly told him, you know, there's something in the garage. We know there's something in the garage, Brendan. So he said things happened in the garage. They get a search warrant to get back into the garage, and lo and behold, they find the magic bullet, the one that I've shown you in the other video and in pictures, magically dust repellent, where there is concrete dust everywhere from when the floor got jackhammered, the crack got jackhammered, and there's dust and concrete dust and everything everywhere. The bullet's clean. It's bright and shiny, you know, for a slug, for a mangled slug, but basically it's not dingy and gray or battleship gray looking or dull looking because of concrete dust that should have been covering it if it was there ever since Teresa was shot. So he brings that up. Then he brings up the jeans. The jeans. Once again, jeans that had bleach on them. That doesn't mean anything. They don't have any DNA. They don't have Teresa's DNA. They don't have any stains on them that look like blood or anything. All there is some bleach on around the I guess the hem of the legs. So yeah, jeans with bleach. We're going to be hearing from very soon here the Mr. Venu, and he's very much an advocate for Brendan Dassey, and you're going to hear him basically tell Mr. Lee basically what he's got wrong, how much he's got wrong. It's kind of funny to actually listen to. So we're going to go ahead and move on here and let John Lee speak a bit more, and then we'll see you again.
And they did not berate him or threaten him or anything. If anybody looks at all of these confessions that were entered into evidence and 18 months worth of hearings before the trial, they would see that, if anything, Tom Fassbender and Mark Wiegert treated Brendan with kid gloves. They did not threaten or anything else. If somebody tells me, the truth will set you free, I don't take that as a threat.
Yeah. This guy is proof that Nancy will have anybody on her show so long as they have the same opinion as her. Because, good Lord, what is this man talking about? Nobody is saying that Fassbender and Wiegert threatened Brendan. Nobody is saying that. Nobody has said that. Nobody's claiming that. What is he talking about? Has he been paying attention to what's going on? I mean, it's so funny to me when she has these people on her show to comment that make statements that are just so obviously like, what are they talking about? I mean, and that's seriously right there one of them. I mean, what that guy? Nobody's claiming that, dude. John, nobody is claiming that he was being threatened. That's not the issue at hand, buddy. So anyways, he's going to get corrected on that pretty soon anyways. But I just had to say it because it's like, oh my gosh, man. And he just keeps going on and on about it, about how it wasn't a threat and all that. And it's like, yeah, that's not the issue at hand, dude. Anyway, here we go.
If you confess, you can sleep tonight, Brendan. If he wasn't sold down the river by his grandparents, he'd be looking at parole pretty quick. He would have 10 years of his sentence in already. And, there's jailhouse recordings and everything else on the threats from Avery and from his dad and other people. The evidence, as it built, was just overwhelming against him. And we went through this for 20 months.
Yeah, your evidence against Brendan was nil. Okay? Literally, let me just explain something to you. If it were not for Len Kaczynski and his complete dereliction of duty, malfeasance, ineffective assistance of counsel, complete just a complete jerk, really. And if it wasn't for him and his PI, who they went in to prove, again, just exactly how suggestible Brendan was, how pliable and malleable Brendan was, they go in and coerce him again, send him back into the hands of Tom Fassbender and Mark Wiegert, so that Mark and Tom can tell him, now that they've got him confessing again, they want to get something. They want to. They realize that he's probably going to go back to telling the story he was telling before because he has so consistently told it. They probably know he's going to go back to that. So while he's still confessing, they're trying to get him on the jail phone, telling his mother that he did these things, so that then they have it on a recording that they played in court 3 times. Okay, for the jury. Okay. That recording would not exist if it were not for Len Kaczynski. So when you hear John Lee and Nancy Grayson here talking about, yeah, if he and his family didn't bully him, you heard the clips that they brought up. Okay, they brought in clips of Alan talking to Brendan about what he should do. Number one, he wasn't telling Brendan to clam up. He was telling Brendan to proclaim his innocence. You know, which is the opposite of what Nancy claimed he was trying to say. So those are the clips they came up with, and clearly they were telling Brendan to tell the truth and to stick to his guns, and they are trying to spin this into they screwed Brendan over. Well, the thing is that that's not the way a lot of us see it. The way a lot of us see it is Brendan was screwed over by his defense counsel. His defense counsel was working for the state, and he was doing it without even talking to his client. That's a problem. That's a serious problem. And like I said, I've played the clip for you before. Even today, the agents of Wisconsin say that Len Kaczynski's behavior is indefensible. Yet, that clip of Brendan on the prison phone talking to his mom was admitted as evidence and was able to be played at the trial 3 times. And that all came from Len Kaczynski. That all originates with Len Kaczynski and him proving, again, just how malleable and suggestible that Brendan is by coercing him again. So, let's move on.
Listen to this.
I'm just going to revisit one thing. When you were in the bedroom and you cut her throat, previously you said that you thought she was alive. Is that still your thought on that?
Yeah.
And why was that?
Because she was breathing a little bit. She was like not trying to breathe as hard as she could from screaming a lot.
She was screaming a lot or wasn't?
She was.
When you cut her throat, was she screaming? Oh. When you cut her throat?
Because when you scream a lot, your breathing goes up or something.
Well, explain that a little bit. You said she was screaming a lot. When was she screaming a lot?
Like,
while you were doing it, after you did it, before you did it?
Before.
Okay, so when I'm listening to this bit, I'm hearing investigators desperate to get a coherent timeline because they know that they haven't gotten a coherent timeline so far. They know that Brendan's confession has just been all over the place and not really making a lot of sense. And so they're trying to lead him down the road where he just gives them a plausible timeline or whatever, basically a sequence of events where things make sense. But as you're going to see, especially in the bit to come, that they're basically pointing it out to themselves. I mean, that's how obvious it is that they're pointing it out to themselves when they're saying, oh, well, when did Stephen, oh, so you did this and this and when after this, when did Stephen do this other thing? And it's like, you know, it's like, how do all of the things that he said, how do they all fit together? And that's kind of exactly the point. They don't. He's been guessing. And if you're listening to this part, he's guessing. He's basically right now he thinks he knows what they want to hear. And so he's just trying to guess what they want because he wants to go back to school. I mean, can't say that specifically from this point, from what he's saying here, Brendan, obviously. But we know that later he's asking to go back to school, so it was obviously in his mind all day. You know what I mean? So we're going to go ahead and listen to the rest of this little bit that they're using here. And like I said, listen for yourself and tell me, does it sound like Brendan is guessing? Again, like he sounds like he is most of the time during these so-called confessions.
When you cut her throat, what was she doing, if anything?
Like screaming for help and crying.
to get that straight. She was screaming for help and crying when you cut her throat?
Yeah.
When did Stephen choke her or strangle her?
Like a little bit after that.
Well, let's just go back a little bit, okay? Tell us what exactly happened to her, what order it happened in. You said there were basically 3 things prior to you guys shooting her. Explain those in the order that it happened.
Starting with when we got in the room.
Yeah, what you guys did to her.
We had sex with her.
Okay.
Then he stabbed her.
And who stabbed her?
He did.
Who's he?
Stephen.
Okay. And then what?
Then I cut her throat.
Okay.
And he choked her and I cut off her hair.
Okay. So he choked her after you cut her throat.
I'm sorry, but I don't believe a word of it.
The issue, I think the answer to that question is simple. It's the confession. And that's what's at the heart of this appeal. And if you read the dissenting opinion, it was a 4-3 decision. It was extremely close. So if you read the dissenting opinion, they raise one point that's critical, which is that the state court in Wisconsin did not take into account Stephen Avery's age as a juvenile and his diminished mental capacity. So if the U.S. Supreme Court thinks that that's important enough, they'll take it. And it's the confession that caught, particularly of Brendan Dassey, that caught everyone's attention because of the length, because of the 20 questions that the detectives played with him that game, giving him answers throughout, feeding him the answers, telling him things that, the truth will set him free, and convincing him over time that this is what he was supposed to say. That caught everyone's attention. And I think that's at the heart of it. The question is a technical one, whether the Supreme Court's going to want to hear that or not. And sometimes, the Supreme Court, with their Ivy League background, they like to keep their noses in the air, the ivory cloud. They may not want to get down in the dirt, but everyone else knows that confession stinks.
So that was Vinu Varghese that you heard talking there. And, he's making all the valid points about why Brendan's confession seems wrong, why it rings so bad that he was coerced, but he goes into talking about the Supreme Court there. That's, he talks about him being like in the ivory tower or the ivory clouds, kind of thing. And will they deign to descend to offer a judgment on this lowly habeas, case with Brendan Dassey? Well, he seems to think it is a long shot. And I think there's a reason why everybody thinks it's a long shot. I think ordinarily this type of thing would be a long shot. However, I think that Brendan Dassey's got a lot of people's attention. I think Brendan Dassey has seriously grabbed the attention of a lot of people in the world. And I think that kind of should give the Supreme Court an indicator that I think it's time to weigh in on false confessions and possible wrongful convictions now in the more modern day, especially when it comes to kids. A lot of people think that you heard like the majority judges saying that that new law needs to be created here. I don't think so. And I think if the Supreme Court ends up seeing this and passing judgment on this, I think they're only going to end up being more clear on what it means to give special care to juveniles. And I think that is how Brendan will prevail. If the Supreme Court does take his case, I truly think that therein lies where he will prevail. Because the special care does not seem to be existent, which in turn makes the fact finding in the case highly suspect, which in turn makes the tactics used on Brendan in the confession, the psychological tactics used on him, really kind of just browbeating him to the point where and because he was so suggestible to begin with, and leading him basically in the directions they wanted him to go. For instance, how many times did they say, "Oh, there's something in the garage, Brendan. We know there's something in the garage." On and on and on and on, where they're basically pushing him to say things happened in the garage. And what do you know? They get him to say things, and they're there with a warrant to get into that garage, and suddenly, boom, we find this bullet that magically repels concrete dust when you're jackhammering up cracks in that garage. So it's interesting stuff, you know. So anyways, that I just wanted to offer my 2 cents, because he was talking about the Supreme Court there, and I know he may be right. I know that most of the time that may be the case, that this sort of a case would have no chance in hell. But I think, hopefully, with the worldwide renown that Brendan Dassey has, that might trump this up to where the Supreme Court will find it necessary to weigh in and give an opinion about, especially taking into account all the new social, research that's being done, and what DNA testing is teaching us about wrongful convictions and false confessions and all that. And I think that this would be a good place for them to possibly start and to address that, so that these circuit courts will have something to look to in the more modern day, that they can look to and go, okay, the Supreme Court has defined that, we need to consider things, we need to, well, with youth, we need to consider special care, obviously a little bit more, but hopefully the Supreme Court will weigh in and just more clearly define things like special care for juveniles, and what possible refinement needs to happen in terms of the read technique, possibly moving forward in the future for adults. But obviously that doesn't pertain with Brendan's case. With Brendan's case, it's only going to be about juveniles. So, but hopefully moving forward in the future, the Supreme Court will address both of these groups, juveniles and adults, when it comes to the disturbing statistics that DNA is showing us, that are teaching us, that are out there, that exist, that are enough to cause concern, especially when you got 1 in 4 confessions in murder cases are false. 25%. That's a disturbing number, folks. So let's go ahead and move back into this.
Detective Tom Fassbender, I'd like to hear your response to Vinu Varghese.
Again, there was many denials. There were many occasions where nothing was said to him during that particular interview. Plus, you have to look at the whole picture. He was talked to 4 or 5 times prior to that particular interview, not necessarily by myself, where it was extremely evident that he was knowingly lying, that he was trying to protect Stephen, and that something serious was bothering him. And so law enforcement went back to him because there was some concern and a belief that he had witnessed something horrible. Not that he had partaken in anything horrible, but that he had witnessed something horrible. So we were talking to him about that. We received information from a cousin and from the school that something was bothering him, and he was making statements. So going into the interview in question, again, it was an interview of what we felt was a witness, until he began making admissions that were tying him to his involvement in this horrible crime.
If you look at the totality of all the times that Brendan was interviewed, Tom and Mark Wiegert did not threaten him or berate him. They did not put him under hot white lights and withhold food.
But that's not the issue. That's not the issue. This is video again. The issue whether they fed him answers of whether a person who's a juvenile was treated properly. There's nobody saying that the detectives beat this kid. No one is saying that. But that's not the issue. It's the issue of whether, when you deal with the juvenile and whether you have somebody who's in diminished mental capacity, whether feeding him answers is proper. And if the Supreme Court says that this is a question of law, they will hear it.
Number one, the issue is coercion. And he was not
That's
coerced.
Correct.
They did not.
Coercion can take many forms, sir. Coercion can take many forms.
And also, don't put this guy up like he's a 60 IQ. He was in mainly mainstream classes at Michigan High School. He had some special ed classes. Coercion is the issue.
Agreed.
I think
And
I
it's
think
been
that
litigated.
editing is the issue, to be honest. I think that the way they edited Brendan's confession, they showed you 10 minutes, or probably 10 hours of statements and interviews, and cherry-picked exactly what they wanted you to see. That's the issue, is how they portrayed his confession, how they portrayed everything else in their film.
Okay, so here we go again. Back to the filmmakers. It's always the filmmakers' fault. Blame the filmmakers for every mistake that Wisconsin ever made. How do you explain those of us who... Okay, she's going on and on here about how the filmmakers edited what we saw of Brendan's confession in Making a Murderer. Yeah, okay. How do you explain those of us who went beyond Making a Murderer, have watched all the confessions, even multiple times, in certain cases? How do you explain those of us who came up with the same opinion after watching all of that? Okay? So to minimize the fact that Brendan was coerced by saying the filmmakers misrepresented it, well, the filmmakers can't misrepresent the entire confession in its entirety. That's the confession. They had nothing to do. They weren't there with their cameras at the Manitowoc Police Department or wherever they went to record Brendan. They weren't there recording that. That was somebody else who recorded the full thing. So those of us who have watched the full thing have seen where they are just constantly prodding and feeding him the information that they need him to have to be able to feed them answers that they find useful. That's what's happening. So this lady here, she goes on to say more things. She parrots something that one of the majority judges said during the oral arguments, talking about this is making new law. No, this is not making new law. This is talking about special care, which was not taken and not exercised here. That's really what this is about, and that's already in Supreme Court decisions. That's already part of Supreme Court law. The majority, obviously, went the way they went. And like I said, they cited something that is obviously false. They cited the control question as proof that Brendan was resisting officers when you read it, you can see that it's clearly proof of the opposite, that he was buckling and acquiescing to officers and telling them what they wanted to hear. So we got a lot of whole snafu-y things here. I think that's one of the things that if the Supreme Court does end up taking a look at this case, they're going to end up looking at that and going, wait, what are they saying here? What, you guys reading this? They're going to be like, oh, what? So I'm thinking that may be one thing that stands out to the Supreme Court if it gets there. Anyways, so we'll go ahead and move into the last remaining bit of this.
And that's why the public's so outraged, because when you look at that confession, what they showed on Making a Murder, my heart was broken. I wanted Brendan to be free. And I think Brendan is a much different situation than Stephen. I think Brendan would have never done anything like this on his own. But to say Brendan was completely coerced and fed the answers when he knew there was information that he liked them to. So I completely disagree with that part of it, and I just wanted to say that because I think that it's very much unfair what the filmmakers did. And John's right; they were advocates for Stephen Avery. They had phone calls with Stephen Avery. They were his buddy. So for them to say that they were not looking for, they were out for criminal justice reform, then tell a true story. Don't embellish it. Don't omit. Don't splice, and don't cut out important parts of the prosecution's side. Let people make their own decision and show a true story, not their forced narrative. That's how I feel about how people were convinced by this film.
Also, if I'm on yet, if somebody wants a quick, concrete example of creative editing, without looking at 10 hours of interviews and comparing them to the short ones that were shown in Making a Murderer, look at some of the graphic examples in Ken Kratz's book.
Decision. It was a 4-3 split. And what I'm saying, and that's a long shot, and I'll be the first one to tell you that. That's a long shot. But what I'm saying is, if the court wants to get its head out of the clouds and actually look at this, it's a question of whether the police should be able to interrogate juveniles and those with limited mental capacities and use their read technique, which is a technique the detective used, and use that on juveniles.
That's changing law. That's changing law. You know that's not possible at the Supreme Court level. They're asking to change law.
Well, as you know, I disagree with that. I don't think we're looking at a change of law here. I think we're looking at the Supreme Court more clearly defining what special care really means. And I think that's where is going to lie the crux of the situation with Brendan. Because there really wasn't special care taken. And really, if any special care was taken, this would have been prevented. But there was no special care taken. Everybody was just rushing headlong towards a goal. And that goal was incriminate Stephen Avery. And I'm sorry, but whether or not Stephen Avery is guilty is a whole other subject. The fact of the matter is that you guys had nothing. There was nothing to incriminate Brendan. All there was two investigators coming in and basically bullying a confession out of him. And then later his own lawyer doing it. So the whole Brendan situation is a train wreck. The fact that there's so many just off the scale things that have happened in relation to his case tell you that it's not innocent that those things happened. It's not. Obviously, it's hard to prove, but the fact of the matter is that for that many outrageous things to happen just tells you that there's something really, really strange going on behind the scenes. So, wanted to go ahead and finish up this little bit of Nancy's podcast just because it primarily had them talking a lot about SCOTUS, about the chances of that Brendan's got about going to SCOTUS, what the kind of issues are at stake. Because you heard that one woman. I mean, did you hear her what she said at the end there? That the Supreme Court level is not for changing law. Is specifically not for changing law. I mean, I'm like, what the hell is she talking about? It's the circuit court level that can't make law. They're the ones that can't make law. The Supreme Court absolutely is the ones who can make law. Nancy gets these really, really strange people on her show, I gotta say. I really honestly gotta say. Who say the very strangest things that aren't true. Supreme Court is exactly where the law could be changed, but I don't think a change of law is really necessary here. I think a more clearly defined definition of what special care really means in terms of juveniles moving forward, I think is probably all that's required, but we'll have to see. The justices of the Supreme Court will make that determination on their own, obviously. I just hope that they deem this has the merit, and that they need to take a look at it, and they need to make some kind of a decision to give some kind of an indicator for the circuit courts moving forward to look at, and to know that the Supreme Court has basically, issued a new judgment that gives clearer definition. So that's about it, folks. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe. We'll see ya.